Mount Rainier rises out of Washington state like a fixed shape in the sky, but beneath that stillness lies a history marked by shifting ice, sudden storms and expeditions that never returned the same way they arrived. Since the earliest recorded climbs in the late 1800s, its glaciers have carried footprints, weather has erased entire routes within hours, and search records have documented outcomes that often remain incomplete long after teams leave the mountain. As you move through this story, what unfolds is not a simple account of accidents, but a closer look at a place where geography, timing, and human judgment intersect in ways that do not always align. You're brought into glaciers that conceal more than they reveal, ridgelines that disappear into cloud without warning, and a pattern of climbs where experience does not always translate into safety. The mountain that watches Seattle. Far above the restless movement of highways, ferry routes, office towers and neighborhoods spread across western Washington, there are mornings when an immense white shape appears silently above the horizon, standing so high and so unexpectedly clear that it seems less like geography than presence, a distant figure observing the region from another scale of time entirely. From downtown Seattle, across the waters of Puget Sound, and through cities stretching south toward Tacoma, the mountain emerges only when weather allows, floating above lower clouds with an unnatural stillness that locals often describe through a familiar phrase, "The mountain is out." Yet behind that casual expression rests something stranger, because what reveals itself in those moments is not simply scenery, but one of the most dangerous mountains in the United States, a place whose calm outline conceals conditions that have repeatedly turned ordinary climbing days into disappearances, fatal falls, and long unanswered recoveries. Rising to 14,410 feet, Mount Rainier dominates the landscape of Washington state, with a scale difficult to understand until it enters the frame unexpectedly, overwhelming skylines from distances that seem too great for anything so physically imposing to remain visible. Indigenous communities knew the mountain long before it carried its modern name, with the Puyallup people referring to it as Tahoma or Tacoma, often translated in varying ways as Mother of Waters or Snow-Covered Mountain, reflecting its immense influence over rivers and surrounding ecosystems, rather than any singular mythology detached from place. The name Mount Rainier arrived later in 1792, when British explorer George Vancouver named it after Rear Admiral Peter Rainier, a naval officer who never saw the mountain himself, leaving behind a title that feels strangely detached from the terrain it came to define. Even from sea level, Rainier seems disproportionate, climbing nearly 3 vertical miles above surrounding lowlands and carrying enough prominence to dominate weather patterns, visibility and imagination across the Pacific Northwest. On clear afternoons, the mountain appears impossibly accessible, especially from the cities beneath it, where distance compresses perspective into deception, and the summit seems close enough to understand simply by looking upward. Snow glows against sunlight, glaciers soften into pale ribbons, and the immense volcanic cone often appears quiet, symmetrical, and strangely welcoming, particularly compared with the jagged violence associated with mountains elsewhere. Unlike remote peaks hidden behind international expeditions or weeks of preparation, Rainier sits near major highways, airports, and population centres, close enough that many visitors decide to approach it casually, treating the national park as a scenic extension of everyday life rather than terrain, responsible for repeated fatalities. That contradiction has shaped the mountain's reputation for generations, because proximity often disguises seriousness, and visibility encourages familiarity even when familiarity has not been earned. The illusion becomes even more unsettling when climbers begin to speak about the mountain in practical terms rather than visual ones, because among mountaineers, Rainier carries a reputation shaped less by beauty than unpredictability. Each year, thousands attempt to climb the summit, particularly through guided expeditions departing from routes such as Disappointment Cleaver or Emmons Glacier, and many succeed, yet success has never erased the understanding that Rainier behaves differently from mountains that merely require endurance. Experienced climbers repeatedly describe rapid weather collapse, unstable snow bridges, hidden crevasses, falling ice, avalanches, volcanic debris, and navigational confusion severe enough to disorient even those familiar with alpine terrain. The danger is not theatrical in the way outsiders often imagine mountain tragedy. Rather, it arrives quietly, through subtle miscalculations, changing temperatures, erased footprints, or moments when visibility collapses into white space and the landscape ceases to offer recognizable direction. Part of what makes Rainier unusually deceptive lies in the fact that it does not initially resemble a place designed to resist human presence so aggressively, because its lower slopes often begin with forests, waterfalls, wildflower meadows, and paved viewpoints crowded with visitors carrying cameras rather than survival equipment. Inside what became Mount Rainier National Park in 1899, one of the oldest national parks in the United States, the transition from approachable beauty to alpine hazard unfolds gradually enough that danger can feel delayed or theoretical. Paradise, the park's famous southern area, receives extraordinary annual snowfall that often exceeds 50 feet in winter accumulation. Yet during calmer months, hikers move through open vistas where glaciers appear motionless and distant. The mountain does not announce escalation loudly. Instead, elevation slowly rearranges conditions until what began as scenery becomes exposure. For those who study climbing accidents on Rainier, a recurring pattern emerges that is difficult to ignore because fatalities have involved both newcomers and experts, guided clients and seasoned mountaineers, solo climbers and organised groups moving with technical preparation. Rescue reports and ranger accounts often reveal a mountain where confidence provides no immunity, and experience only narrows probability rather than removing risk entirely. Weather systems sweeping inland from the Pacific Ocean can change with startling speed, producing whiteouts so complete that landmarks disappear, and climbers lose orientation only a short distance from established routes, while temperatures, wind, and snow conditions transform terrain that seemed stable hours earlier into something unstable enough to punish hesitation or poor timing. Many climbers who return safely speak of the mountain not with triumph but restraint, describing it as a place that allows passage temporarily rather than one conquered. What deepens the unease surrounding Rainier is the uneasy balance between constant visibility and incomplete understanding, because millions live within sight of a mountain they may never truly comprehend. Children grow up seeing it framed between buildings or reflected across water. Commuters glance toward it between changing weather fronts, and tourists photograph it from roadsides without realizing they are looking at an active stratovolcano, capped by the largest glacial system in the contiguous United States. The mountain is watched endlessly, yet much of what makes it dangerous remains hidden from ordinary view beneath snowfields, inside fractured ice, or behind sudden atmospheric shifts invisible from the cities below. Somewhere beneath that calm white silhouette rests a landscape shaped by fire, pressure, ice and movement, waiting to reveal how little of its surface can truly be trusted. A volcano wrapped in ice. Beneath the silence of its snowfields, small changes are constantly unfolding beyond ordinary sight, leaving the mountain strangely difficult to understand from a distance or even from within. From Seattle, Tacoma, or the roads winding toward the national park, Mount Rainier often appears suspended in stillness, its broad white summit holding the same calm shape against the horizon day after day. Yet much of what gives the mountain its reputation for danger begins precisely in the gap between appearance and reality, because what seems motionless is rarely still, and what appears solid often hides instability beneath only a few feet of snow and ice. Climbers approaching the upper mountain frequently describe an unsettling transition in perception, a gradual awareness that familiar instincts stop working as reliably here, where surfaces shift silently, landmarks vanish into weather, and certainty becomes difficult to hold for very long. Rainier does not conceal danger through spectacle or violence visible from afar. Instead, it disguises risk inside ordinary-looking terrain, asking visitors to trust what they see while quietly altering the meaning of what stands beneath them. Long before climbers learned to read its ridges and glaciers, immense geological forces had already begun shaping a landscape where heat and ice would remain uneasily bound together. Mount Rainier is an active stratovolcano, rising layer upon layer through eruptions that unfolded over hundreds of thousands of years, its immense cone built from hardened lava, volcanic rock, ash deposits, and glacial reshaping that together formed one of the tallest mountains in North America outside Alaska. Although its summit today appears dominated by snow and ice, the mountain belongs to the volcanic chain of the Cascade Range, shaped by the movement of tectonic plates beneath the Pacific Northwest, where the oceanic Juan de Fuca plate slowly descends beneath the North American plate in a geological process that continues even now. The last confirmed eruption occurred in the 19th century, though Rainier remains geologically active, monitored closely because signs of volcanic heat still emerge near the summit in the form of fumaroles, openings that release warm volcanic gases into freezing air. Even near the top, where snow seems absolute, pockets of warmth carve tunnels and caves into ice, creating hidden spaces shaped not by weather but by heat, rising quietly from beneath the mountain itself. Few places embody contradiction so completely, because Rainier carries fire beneath ice, motion beneath stillness, and instability beneath a form that outwardly suggests permanence. Across the upper slopes, what appears frozen in place is often moving with a slowness too gradual for the eye to notice, though powerful enough to reshape the mountain year after year. Mount Rainier contains the largest concentration of glaciers in the contiguous United States, with more than 24 major named glaciers extending outward from the summit region, including the Emmons, Carbon, Nisqually, Winthrop and Couts glaciers, each functioning less like frozen scenery and more like slow rivers of compressed ice. Though their movement can seem impossible to imagine while standing nearby, glaciers shift under their own immense weight, deforming, cracking, advancing, or retreating according to snowfall, temperature, and pressure accumulated across seasons. Layers of snow gradually compact into dense ice, and under enough force that the ice begins to move downhill, carrying rock, sediment, and instability with it. To climbers, glaciers transform travel into something different from ordinary mountaineering because the terrain itself cannot be assumed permanent. A route crossed safely weeks earlier may no longer exist in quite the same form after storms, thawing, snowfall, or internal movement reshape the surface. Even silence behaves strangely there, absorbed into broad frozen expanses where sound travels differently and distance becomes difficult to judge. At certain elevations, the surface begins offering quiet illusions of stability, concealing fractures beneath snow that may appear no different from the terrain surrounding them. Crevasses, deep cracks formed by glacier movement and tension within shifting ice, can open into spaces large enough to swallow climbers entirely, sometimes stretching dozens or even hundreds of feet downward into blue darkness, shaped by pressure and time. Many remain visible, jagged interruptions across glaciers that force careful navigation, but others disappear beneath snow bridges, thin coverings of accumulated snow that disguise emptiness below and create one of Rainier's most persistent dangers. From above, a snow bridge may resemble ordinary ground, smooth and unremarkable beneath boots, yet temperature changes, weight distribution, seasonal shifts, and unseen weakness determine whether it will hold or collapse. This hidden uncertainty explains why rope systems, spacing between climbers, and glacier travel techniques remain essential on many routes, because the mountain repeatedly creates situations where danger exists, not in dramatic cliffs or visible hazards, but beneath surfaces that appear deceptively calm. Rainier rarely announces instability clearly. Instead, it asks people to move forward through uncertainty, while trusting terrain they know may not deserve trust. Without warning or spectacle, conditions on Rainier can shift into something unfamiliar, narrowing visibility so completely that even nearby landmarks seem to withdraw into blankness. Weather systems sweeping inland from the Pacific Ocean encounter the mountain abruptly, forced upward into colder elevations where storms can intensify with surprising speed, creating sudden wind, snowfall, freezing temperatures, and dense clouds capable of transforming orientation into confusion within hours. What unsettles experienced climbers is not simply the severity of weather, but the speed with which clarity disappears, because Rainier's broad snowfields and glaciers offer few reliable visual markers once fog or whiteout conditions settle over them. Ground, sky, and distance begin merging into the same pale absence, flattening perception until slopes lose definition and even simple movement becomes psychologically exhausting. Climbers navigating in such conditions often rely on GPS, altimeters, route memory, compasses, or carefully placed markers, yet even preparation offers no complete protection when visibility shrinks enough to erase confidence itself. A mountain visible from cities hundreds of miles away becomes strangely unreadable once someone stands inside its weather. Because the mountain rarely announces danger all at once, many of its harshest realities emerge gradually, hidden behind hours that can seem calm, manageable, and deceptively ordinary. Lower slopes often begin in forested terrain alive with rivers, waterfalls, and open meadows, while summer climbing seasons may greet visitors with stable skies that seem to confirm confidence rather than challenge it. Guided expeditions regularly move upward through disciplined pacing, familiar checkpoints, and established routes, reinforcing the impression that preparation has transformed unpredictability into structure. Yet Rainier repeatedly resists simplification because elevation changes conditions faster than expectations adjust. Temperature shifts weaken snow, storms arrive unexpectedly, ice alters shape, and fatigue accumulates quietly enough that recognition often comes late, after terrain has already become less forgiving. Unlike mountains whose danger feels obvious from the beginning, Rainier often reveals seriousness through escalation, waiting until familiarity settles in before changing the terms of movement almost without warning. Elsewhere along the higher routes, the landscape itself refuses permanence, shifting through snowfall, thaw, volcanic debris, and pressure in ways that quietly alter familiar ground. Avalanches remain a constant concern in certain seasons and conditions, particularly where steep snow accumulates into unstable layers, vulnerable to collapse under changing temperature or weight, while falling ice and rock periodically reshape sections of climbing terrain exposed to thawing and instability. Beneath snowfields lie deposits of volcanic rubble known as tephra, loose fragments of rock and ash left behind through past eruptions, terrain capable of shifting unexpectedly beneath movement and contributing to Rainier's reputation for unpredictability. Even routes widely used during climbing seasons demand constant reassessment, because glaciers open new crevasses, snow bridges weaken, and weather transforms surfaces that may have appeared reliable days earlier. Rangers, guides, and experienced climbers frequently speak of the mountain less as a fixed landscape than a system in motion, one requiring renewed attention every season, because memory alone becomes unreliable against terrain that quietly rearranges itself. Seen from afar, the mountain still appears composed and motionless, yet closer examination reveals a place where certainty weakens the longer someone remains inside it. Rainier's danger emerges not from a single dramatic force but from accumulation. Invisible heat beneath snow, glaciers that move while appearing still, fractures hidden beneath ordinary surfaces, storms capable of dissolving orientation, and terrain altered so gradually that change often escapes notice until consequences begin to form. Perhaps this is what makes the mountain feel uniquely deceptive to those who study it, because the threats rarely announce themselves with spectacle, choosing instead to remain embedded within beauty, patience, and silence, hidden beneath a landscape that continues inviting admiration even as it quietly resists understanding. Certain stretches of the mountain would soon become known less for where they led than for what too often failed to return from them. The route where people vanish. Within climbing circles that return year after year to Rainier, certain route names are often mentioned only after a noticeable pause in conversation, as though acknowledging them requires a different tone than the rest of the mountain. The pauses are rarely dramatic, yet they carry an unspoken recognition that not every section of the same peak is approached with equal confidence, and that some lines on the map have accumulated reputations shaped less by imagination than by repeated experience in conditions where outcomes have not always aligned with expectations. Mount Rainier, despite its accessibility from populated valleys and its visibility from cities like Seattle and Tacoma, contains climbing corridors that differ so sharply in exposure and complexity that experienced mountaineers treat them as separate problems rather than variations of a single ascent. What appears from below as a single, snow-covered mountain reveals, at higher resolution, a network of routes where difficulty is not evenly distributed but concentrated in specific passages that demand constant attention to terrain, timing, and environmental change. Across the broad volcanic mass of Mount Rainier, the paths leading upward are not uniform in difficulty, with each corridor shaped by distinct combinations of slope angle, glacier movement, exposure, and seasonal instability. Unlike mountains where a single established route defines the standard ascent, Rainier presents multiple approaches that intersect with different glaciers and ridgelines, each influenced by shifting ice formations and the unpredictable layering of snow throughout the year. Some routes are regularly used during guided climbs, maintained through seasonal familiarity and repeated passage, while others require more technical decision-making and careful navigation through terrain that can change between seasons or even within a single climbing window. The variation is not only in physical steepness, but in how the terrain responds to weather, temperature, and accumulated snowfall, meaning that a route considered manageable in one period may present significantly different conditions in another. This variability has contributed to a culture among climbers where route selection is treated as a critical decision rather than a matter of preference, because the mountain itself does not offer a consistent interpretation of difficulty. On the northern flank of the mountain, Liberty Ridge rises in a narrow and exposed line that has earned attention from climbers for the technical seriousness required simply to remain on its terrain. The route follows a steep ascent toward the summit region, passing through sections shaped by mixed rock, ice, and snow, where exposure increases significantly as elevation rises and weather patterns shift without warning. Unlike more frequently travelled glacier routes, Liberty Ridge is less forgiving in its margins for error, partly due to its steep angle and partly due to its position on the mountain, which leaves it more directly exposed to incoming weather systems and unstable snow accumulation. Climbers who study the route often note that its challenge is not defined by a single obstacle, but by the accumulation of sustained difficulty across its entire length, where progress requires continuous adjustment to changing surface conditions. The terrain itself can demand constant reassessment, as ice, snow, and rock interact in ways that alter footing and stability over relatively short distances, creating an environment where forward movement depends on constant evaluation rather than routine progression. High above the surrounding valleys, reaching a climber in distress often depends on conditions that can shift too quickly for even coordinated rescue efforts to respond in time. Mount Rainier's elevation and weather patterns frequently limit the ability of helicopters to operate safely near upper slopes, particularly when wind speeds increase or visibility declines rapidly across glacier-covered terrain. Even when response teams are prepared, the mountain's scale and unpredictable atmospheric changes can narrow the available window for aerial access, leaving ground-based rescue operations to contend with steep slopes, crevasse fields, and rapidly changing snow conditions. Communication itself can become difficult in higher regions where terrain blocks signals or where weather interferes with consistent transmission, adding further complexity to coordination efforts. These limitations are not theoretical but structural, shaped by the mountain's geography and climate rather than by any single incident, which is why climbers and guides often emphasize planning and timing as critical factors long before an emergency ever occurs. Over decades of recorded ascents and attempted routes, Rainier's history includes repeated accounts of falls, missing climbers, and recoveries complicated by terrain that can conceal evidence beneath shifting ice. Glaciers on the mountain move slowly but persistently over time, carrying material within their structure and altering the surface in ways that can obscure or relocate traces of past activity. This means that when incidents occur in remote or heavily glaciated areas, the passage of time and movement of ice can complicate efforts to reconstruct events with clarity, particularly in regions where access is limited and environmental conditions remain unstable. Mountaineering records and ranger reports describe patterns that reflect not a single type of incident, but a range of outcomes shaped by weather, terrain exposure, and timing, where even experienced climbers can be affected by conditions that develop faster than adjustments can be made. The mountain scale ensures that such events are distributed across different routes and elevations, reinforcing the understanding that risk is not confined to one area, but embedded across multiple environments that change with season and weather. For those who guide expeditions or return repeatedly to alpine environments, certain sections of Rainier are discussed less as objectives and more as areas requiring constant reassessment and respect. Experienced climbers tend to evaluate terrain not only by technical grading, but by how conditions evolve, particularly in glaciated environments, where snow accumulation, ice formation, and seasonal melt can significantly alter surface stability. On Rainier, this approach becomes especially important because familiarity with a route does not guarantee consistent conditions, and prior experience must always be weighed against present observation. Guides and veteran climbers often emphasize the importance of reading the mountain in real time, adjusting decisions based on visible conditions rather than expectation, since changes in weather or snow structure can influence difficulty in ways that are not immediately predictable. This emphasis on continuous assessment reflects a broader understanding within mountaineering that experience provides tools rather than certainty, especially in environments shaped by constant environmental change. Elsewhere on the mountain, routes such as the Emmons Glacier approach, Kautz Glacier route, and Disappointment Cleaver present their own evolving challenges shaped by snow conditions and glacial change. Each of these corridors interacts differently with the mountain's ice systems, creating variation in how crevasses form, how snow bridges develop, and how seasonal conditions influence overall accessibility. The Emmons Glacier route, for example, involves extensive glacier travel across one of the mountain's largest ice flows, where surface conditions can vary widely depending on temperature and recent weather patterns. The Kautz Glacier route introduces steeper sections and more direct exposure to mixed terrain, where snow and rock transitions can demand additional technical awareness. The Disappointment Cleaver route, widely used during climbing seasons, is subject to frequent changes in its glacier structure, requiring ongoing adjustments to its established path as ice movement and seasonal melt reshape the landscape. These differences illustrate how Rainier's climbing experience is not defined by a single ascent profile, but by a collection of shifting environments that each carry their own evolving challenges. After enough seasons of climbing and reporting, some locations on Rainier begin accumulating reputations that persist, even when conditions temporarily appear calm or unchanged. These reputations are shaped over time through repeated encounters with difficult terrain, documented incidents, and the shared accounts of those who have moved through the mountain under varying conditions. What develops is not myth in the traditional sense, but a form of collective memory within the climbing community, where certain sections are treated with heightened awareness, because history has shown them to demand more careful attention. Even when conditions seem favourable, the awareness of what has occurred in those places before can influence how climbers approach them, reinforcing a sense that terrain carries context beyond what is immediately visible. In this way, the mountain becomes not only a physical environment, but a layered record of human interaction with shifting ice, steep ridges, and changing weather. And in places where past attempts had already been erased by time and weather, the mountain seemed to remember more than those who returned from it could easily explain. The storm that changes everything. Moments before conditions fully shift, there is often a brief interval on Rainier where nothing appears different, yet perception has already begun to fall slightly out of alignment with reality. From a distance, such changes would be impossible to notice, because the mountain still carries the same broad geometry of snow, ice, and volcanic mass that defines its presence above western Washington. Yet those who spend time moving across its upper slopes often describe a more subtle phenomenon, where understanding does not fail abruptly, but begins to arrive a fraction too late. Footing that once felt predictable starts requiring additional attention. Distance becomes harder to interpret with confidence, and simple movement begins to feel slightly out of sync with judgment, as though the environment has adjusted its pace without announcing the adjustment itself. Nothing dramatic signals the shift, and no single moment marks its arrival, but the accumulation of small mismatches between expectation and observation gradually introduces uncertainty into what should have remained straightforward. Sudden transitions in mountain weather can unfold so quickly that the progression from clarity to obstruction feels compressed into a span shorter than expectation allows. On Mount Rainier, atmospheric systems arriving from the Pacific Ocean encounter steep elevation that forces air upward into colder layers, where moisture condenses rapidly and clouds can form, thicken, and descend across terrain in a remarkably short time frame. Climbers who begin an ascent under clear skies may encounter a noticeably different environment only a few hours later, where wind intensifies, temperature drops, and snow or cloud cover begins reshaping visibility in ways that alter both pace and decision-making. The mountain does not necessarily experience weather as isolated events, but as continuous transitions, where conditions build upon one another until clarity gives way to a denser atmosphere that compresses space and reduces visual reference points. In these moments, the most significant change is not only what can be seen, but how quickly the environment stops matching the memory of what was seen earlier in the same climb. As surrounding detail begins dissolving into uniform brightness, the mind often continues processing a version of the landscape that is no longer physically present. Whiteout conditions on glaciated terrain do not simply reduce visibility, they flatten spatial perception to such an extent that snow, sky, and horizon can merge into a single field, lacking distinguishable depth. In this environment, even experienced climbers may find that the terrain ahead becomes difficult to interpret, not because it has changed in form, but because contrast and reference have disappeared. Movement continues, yet the usual feedback mechanisms that confirm direction and distance weaken, leaving only partial cues that require greater mental effort to assemble into meaning. The result is not immediate disorientation in the dramatic sense, but a gradual misalignment between what the body is doing and what the mind believes is still visible. Even carefully learned routes and planned directions can begin to lose reliability when internal judgment updates more slowly than environmental change. Navigation on Mount Rainier depends heavily on a combination of prior route knowledge, physical markers, and instruments such as GPS devices and compasses, yet each of these tools relies on interpretation that can be disrupted when visibility collapses or terrain becomes indistinct. Snowfall can obscure established tracks, wind can erase surface markings within minutes, and shifting cloud cover can eliminate visual landmarks that were previously used for orientation. In such conditions, climbers often rely more heavily on memory and inference, attempting to reconstruct position based on incomplete or fading information. When the environment continues changing while interpretation lags, even correct decisions can feel uncertain in the moment they are made, because the confirmation normally provided by clear surroundings is no longer available. At altitude, reduced oxygen availability gradually alters the pace at which thought, reaction, and spatial awareness remain synchronized. Mount Rainier rises to 14,410 feet, where atmospheric pressure is significantly lower than at sea level, meaning each breath delivers less oxygen to the body and brain than it would in lower elevations. This reduction does not typically produce immediate collapse, but instead influences cognitive function in subtle ways that become more noticeable under physical exertion, cold exposure, and sustained decision-making. Attention narrows, mental processing slows, and the ability to evaluate multiple variables at once becomes more limited, particularly when combined with fatigue and environmental stress. In practical terms, this means that even routine choices require more effort than expected, and the gap between observation and understanding can widen without clear awareness that it is happening. When conditions become unstable, the gap between recognizing a problem and responding to it can widen in ways that subtly influence every subsequent choice. In a mountain environment where weather, terrain, and physical strain interact continuously, decision-making does not occur in isolation, but within a stream of changing inputs that must be interpreted in real time. A route that appears manageable at one moment may demand reassessment shortly afterward, as visibility shifts or surface conditions alter, requiring climbers to adjust plans without the benefit of stable reference points. Under such pressure, hesitation can become more frequent, not due to uncertainty alone, but due to the time required for the mind to reconcile new information with existing expectations. The consequences of delayed response are rarely immediate in a visible sense, yet they accumulate through small inefficiencies in movement, timing, and judgment that gradually reshape the trajectory of a climb. In accounts given after descent, climbers often describe experiences that feel uneven in retrospect, as though sections of time were recorded without consistent clarity. These descriptions do not usually rely on dramatic language, but instead emphasize fragmentation, where certain intervals appear more distinct than others, and memory seems to compress or blur moments that were physically prolonged. Such recollections are often associated with periods of heavy weather, fatigue, or limited visibility, where environmental stress and physiological strain interact to reduce the brain's ability to encode experience in a continuous sequence. What remains afterward is not always a smooth narrative of events, but a collection of impressions that require reconstruction, often with gaps that cannot be easily filled by logic alone. This unevenness contributes to the sense that the mountain experience does not always translate cleanly into memory, even for those who are accustomed to operating in demanding alpine environments. After extended exposure to severe conditions, the sequence of events itself can become difficult to reconstruct in the same order it was originally experienced. On Mount Rainier, where changing weather systems, glacial terrain, and altitude effects frequently intersect, the continuity of experience can break down in ways that make temporal sequencing less reliable. Climbers may recall reaching certain points, making specific decisions, or encountering particular conditions, Yet the precise order in which these moments occurred can become unclear when viewed in hindsight. This does not imply a loss of awareness during the event, but rather a limitation in how environmental stress affects the brain's ability to organize experience into a stable timeline. As a result, recollection often becomes dependent on external markers or recorded data, rather than purely internal memory, in order to reconstruct what took place in a coherent form. Looking back afterward, what often stands out is not confusion during the event itself, but how quickly the memory of it becomes difficult to organize into a clear sequence. The difficulty lies not only in recalling individual moments, but in re-establishing the structure that once connected them, especially when those moments were shaped by rapidly changing conditions that left uneven impressions across time. Even when physical facts remain unchanged, the internal ordering of experience can shift during recollection, influenced by fatigue, stress, and the absence of continuous reference points during the event itself. This creates a lingering sense that what was experienced on the mountain does not fully align with how it can later be described, as though the structure of time itself had been temporarily loosened during the ascent and only partially restored afterward. By the time perception realigned with reality, the mountain had already moved forward in ways awareness could no longer easily track. The mountain that doesn't forgive experience. Across recorded climbing activity on Mount Rainier, there is a consistent expectation that familiarity with alpine environments should naturally reduce exposure to critical risk. This expectation is not unique to Rainier, but it becomes especially significant on a mountain that attracts both first-time climbers and highly experienced mountaineers within the same seasonal windows, often sharing similar routes, weather systems, and logistical frameworks. In theory, repeated exposure to alpine conditions allows individuals to refine judgment, anticipate environmental change, and improve decision-making under pressure, creating a gradual reduction in uncertainty with each successful ascent. Yet Rainier's documented climbing history reveals that this assumption, while logically grounded, does not operate as a guarantee, particularly in environments where external variables shift independently of human familiarity. The mountain does not differentiate between first-time attempts and repeated summits in the way experience might suggest it should, because the underlying conditions that govern outcomes are not static between ascents, even when routes appear unchanged from one season to the next. Within structured mountaineering practice, experience is typically treated as a stabilizing factor that improves judgment, efficiency, and route decision-making over time. This principle is reflected in how climbers are trained to interpret terrain, manage pacing, recognize hazards, and respond to changing conditions using accumulated knowledge from prior ascents. On Mount Rainier, this includes familiarity with glacier travel techniques, rope systems, altitude management, and seasonal route variations that are essential for safe progression through the mountain's diverse environments. Experience also informs how climbers interpret subtle indicators such as snow texture, wind patterns, cloud formation, and temperature shifts, which can collectively signal changes in stability or accessibility. However, even with these advantages, experience functions within a framework that depends on environmental consistency. And when that consistency is disrupted by shifting conditions, the predictive value of experience becomes more limited than it might initially appear. Throughout documented history on Rainier, certain incidents involve highly experienced climbers, including guides and repeat summiteers, whose outcomes still ended in fatal or unresolved situations. These cases are not defined by lack of preparation or unfamiliarity with alpine environments, but rather by circumstances where established competence did not prevent adverse outcomes under specific conditions. Mountaineering records and ranger documentation reflect that such events are distributed across different routes and elevations, often occurring in situations where climbers were operating within their normal scope of expertise. In some instances, teams had completed similar ascents before, while in others, individuals were highly familiar with the mountain itself, having navigated its glaciers and ridgelines across multiple seasons. Despite this familiarity, the outcomes demonstrate that experience alone does not fully determine safety when multiple environmental factors converge in ways that reduce available margin for adjustment. In many of these recorded events, analysis often points toward timing-related alignment between environmental change and movement as a critical factor influencing outcome. Rather than a single identifiable failure, conditions frequently involve a sequence where weather shifts, terrain exposure, and climber positioning intersect within a narrow time frame that limits the possibility of a corrective response. On a mountain like Rainier, where atmospheric systems can evolve rapidly, and terrain includes extensive glacier coverage, small differences in timing can produce significantly different operational conditions. A route that is manageable under one set of conditions may become substantially more complex when wind, visibility, or surface stability changes occur during the same period of travel. In this context, timing does not function as a minor variable, but as a structural element that influences how all other factors interact, shaping whether experience can be effectively applied in real time. During guided ascents, structured protocols define specific decision points intended to limit exposure when conditions begin shifting beyond acceptable thresholds. These frameworks are developed through accumulated mountaineering practice and are designed to introduce consistency into decision-making in environments where uncertainty is unavoidable. Guides are trained to evaluate conditions continuously, using predefined criteria such as weather stability, snow integrity, team condition, and time constraints to determine whether continuation remains within acceptable safety margins. Turnaround times, in particular, play a critical role in ensuring that descent occurs before environmental conditions or fatigue levels exceed manageable limits. However, even within these structured systems, decisions still depend on real-time interpretation of conditions that may be changing faster than they can be fully assessed, meaning that protocols function as safeguards rather than guarantees. Repeated ascents of the same routes under similar preparation levels do not guarantee consistent results when underlying environmental conditions vary between attempts. On Mount Rainier, glacial surfaces, snowpack stability, and weather exposure can differ significantly across seasons, months, or even days, altering the difficulty and risk profile of a route that may otherwise appear familiar. Climbers returning to known paths may recognize structural features of the terrain, yet still encounter variations in snow bridges, crevasse visibility, wind exposure, or surface hardness that require immediate adaptation. This variability means that repetition does not produce a fixed climbing environment, but rather repeated exposure to a system that is continuously being reshaped by natural processes. As a result, prior success on a route cannot be interpreted as a stable indicator of future conditions, even when preparation and experience remain constant. When incidents are examined collectively, recurring structural factors often appear more consistently than any single identifiable human error. Analyses of mountaineering outcomes on Rainier frequently emphasize combinations of environmental exposure, timing, terrain variability, and physiological strain as contributing elements that interact rather than operate independently. In such evaluations, individual decision-making is considered within the broader context of conditions that limit available options at the moment choices are required. This approach shifts focus away from singular points of failure and towards systems of interaction, where multiple moderate pressures combine to produce outcomes that may not have been predictable from any single variable alone. Over time, this pattern-based understanding has become an important part of how alpine risk is studied, particularly in environments where conditions evolve rapidly and unpredictably. Ultimately, accumulated experience refines decision-making under uncertainty, but it does not eliminate the possibility of conditions aligning beyond anticipated margins. Even highly skilled climbers operate within environmental systems that can change in ways that reduce the effectiveness of prior knowledge, not by invalidating it, but by limiting its applicability within a specific moment in time. On Mount Rainier, where weather, terrain, and physical exertion intersect continuously, the space between preparation and outcome is shaped not only by ability, but by how those variables interact at critical thresholds. Experience remains an essential component of safe climbing practice, but it functions within constraints that are defined by the mountain's variability rather than by human expectation. In this sense, expertise reduces uncertainty without fully removing it, leaving a margin where the outcome is determined by factors that extend beyond accumulated skill. At that point, even the most reliable judgment could no longer account for how the mountain would respond next. The searchers who rarely arrive on time. After a climber fails to reappear on Mount Rainier, attention shifts away from ascent narratives toward coordinated response structures operating across the mountain. The climb itself, which may have been tracked through weather reports, route planning, or last known positions, becomes secondary to a different kind of operation entirely, one defined not by upward movement, but by the attempt to reconstruct what is no longer visible. In these situations, the mountain is no longer treated as a destination or a challenge, but as an active search environment where time, terrain, and atmospheric conditions determine how quickly information can be gathered and interpreted. What begins as uncertainty on the slope gradually becomes a structured response effort below it, where decisions are shaped by fragmented data, shifting conditions, and the limitations of operating in a landscape that does not easily reveal what it has covered. The transition is immediate in purpose but slow in execution, because the environment itself dictates how much can be done at any given moment. Operating under Mount Rainier National Park protocols, search and rescue teams rely on layered coordination between rangers, climbing specialists, and emergency management systems. These operations are not centralized in a single location, but distributed across personnel who must interpret evolving conditions while preparing for rapidly changing access windows. Rangers stationed in the park coordinate initial assessments based on last known positions, weather forecasts, and terrain familiarity, while specialized teams prepare for deployment into alpine environments where navigation requires both technical skill and environmental awareness. Communication between units is essential, yet often complicated by the same geographical features that define the mountain itself, including elevation changes, ridge formations, and areas where signal transmission becomes inconsistent. Every response is shaped by the understanding that conditions may already have shifted between the moment an incident is reported and the moment action becomes possible, making planning a continuously updated process rather than a fixed sequence of steps. Helicopter access above the mountain is restricted by atmospheric ceilings, wind variability, and visibility thresholds that can change within short spatial ranges. Aircraft operations in alpine environments depend on stable conditions that allow pilots to maintain visual reference with terrain, while navigating elevation and unpredictable airflow patterns generated by the mountain structure. On Mount Rainier, cloud layers can form and dissipate rapidly across different elevations, meaning that conditions suitable for flight at one level may not extend to higher zones where search areas are located. Wind patterns around ridges and glaciers can create turbulence that further limits safe approach paths, while sudden weather changes can narrow operational windows without extended warning. These constraints mean that aerial search efforts are often intermittent, requiring teams to take advantage of brief periods of stability while remaining grounded during extended intervals where conditions exceed safety thresholds. As a result, the timing of deployment becomes as critical as the search itself. Steep glacier fields and fractured ice routes often force ground teams into slow, high-risk traversal paths that mirror many of the same environmental barriers faced by climbers. Unlike recreational ascents, search operations require movement across terrain that may not follow established routes, as teams are often required to access areas outside standard climbing paths in order to investigate possible locations. Glacier surfaces can conceal deep crevasses beneath snow bridges, and surface stability can vary significantly depending on temperature, recent snowfall, and time of day. This means that each step requires assessment rather than assumption, and progress is measured not only in distance but in safety evaluation at every stage. Rope systems, probing techniques, and careful route selection become essential tools in environments where visibility and terrain integrity cannot be fully relied upon. The effort to locate missing individuals therefore unfolds slowly, shaped by both caution and necessity. Delays in locating missing climbers frequently arise from environmental inaccessibility rather than logistical inefficiency within rescue operations. The structure of Mount Rainier itself creates natural barriers that limit how quickly certain areas can be reached, particularly when weather conditions reduce visibility or when snow and ice conditions make travel unsafe. Even when personnel are fully prepared and equipment is available, access may depend entirely on short-lived environmental windows that permit movement into higher elevations. This means that response time is often governed by external conditions rather than internal readiness, creating intervals where operations must pause despite ongoing coordination. These delays are not unusual within alpine search environments, but they become especially significant on a mountain where terrain complexity and weather volatility frequently intersect. Slow glacier displacement on Rainier continuously reshapes buried terrain, gradually altering the position and visibility of objects embedded within its ice. Glaciers function as moving systems, carrying material within their structure over time, while simultaneously exposing and concealing different layers of terrain depending on seasonal conditions and long-term movement. This means that what becomes hidden during one period may not remain in the same location indefinitely, as ice flow can gradually shift embedded material across different sections of the glacier. In search and recovery contexts, this introduces a temporal dimension to location efforts, where the position of objects is not fixed, but subject to slow environmental transformation. As a result, areas that were previously inaccessible or obscured may later become visible under different seasonal conditions, altering the landscape of information available to search teams over time. Historical records from glaciated mountain environments frequently document recoveries occurring long after initial incidents due to seasonal ice movement and exposure cycles. These patterns are not unique to Mount Rainier but are common in alpine regions where glacier systems retain and later release material as they shift over extended periods. In such cases, recovery is not always the result of immediate search success, but of environmental processes gradually revealing what was previously concealed. Seasonal melt, ice thinning, and long-term glacier movement can expose areas that were once completely inaccessible, allowing for discoveries that occur well beyond the initial operational window. This delayed visibility means that the conclusion of a search effort does not always coincide with the resolution of information, as environmental conditions continue to evolve independently of human activity. What remains unresolved often persists not as absence alone, but as information temporarily locked within shifting environmental conditions. In this context, uncertainty is not static but dynamic, influenced by ongoing changes in terrain, ice movement, and weather patterns that continue long after initial operations conclude. The mountain retains a physical record shaped by both presence and concealment, where evidence may be distributed across time rather than space, emerging only when conditions allow for exposure. Search efforts, therefore, exist within a broader temporal framework, where answers may arrive not through immediate discovery, but through gradual environmental change. This creates a situation in which closure is not always immediate, and understanding may develop incrementally as the mountain continues its slow transformation. Yet, even after every unanswered absence, the same mountain continues to draw new ascents back into its silence. The mountain that keeps calling them back. Incident reports from Mount Rainier frequently show that future expedition planning often reintroduces the same mountain environments despite prior documented outcomes. In practical terms, the record of an event on the mountain rarely functions as a closing point in the broader climbing culture surrounding it. Instead, it becomes part of a continuous archive of reference, where past incidents are studied, analysed, and sometimes mentally filed alongside technical route planning for future ascents. This creates a pattern in which the mountain is not only remembered through outcomes, but repeatedly re-entered through intention, as though prior knowledge does not seal access to it, but instead refines the terms under which access is attempted again. Within this structure, the mountain exists less as a finished chapter and more as an ongoing reference point that continues to shape decision-making long after specific events have concluded. Studies of human interaction with controlled risk environments indicate that repeated exposure can alter perception of danger in ways that do not consistently lead to avoidance. In mountaineering contexts, this does not necessarily manifest as disregard for safety, but rather as a gradual recalibration of what risk feels like when it is experienced within structured, technical, and skill-dependent environments. Mount Rainier, as a frequently climbed and highly documented peak, becomes part of this pattern through its accessibility to trained climbers and guided expeditions, where exposure to challenging conditions is often interpreted through the lens of competence development. Over time, repeated engagement with such environments can shift how uncertainty is processed, particularly when outcomes are understood as dependent on timing, preparation, and environmental alignment rather than a single fixed factor. This does not eliminate awareness of risk, but it can change how that risk is mentally organised when future decisions are being considered. Within climbing culture, sustained engagement with alpine terrain is often incorporated into identity formation, shaping how individuals define experience and competence. In this context, mountaineering is not only a physical activity but also a framework through which endurance, technical ability, and familiarity with environmental complexity are interpreted as markers of personal progression. Mount Rainier occupies a particular position within this framework because it functions simultaneously as a training ground, a challenge environment, and a frequently revisited objective for climbers based in the Pacific Northwest. The repeated presence of the mountain in training cycles, guided ascents, and personal expeditions reinforces its role as a consistent point of reference within climbing development. As a result, engagement with Rainier is often less about a single ascent and more about ongoing participation in a system where experience is accumulated incrementally through repeated exposure to similar yet never identical conditions. Everest occupies a symbolic position in global mountaineering defined largely by altitude, while Mount Rainier is characterized by technical variability and rapid environmental change. This distinction shapes how each mountain is approached, both in logistical planning and in the psychological framing of risk. Everest is often associated with extreme elevation, extended expedition timelines, and highly structured commercial climbing systems, whereas Rainier is more frequently encountered through shorter duration ascents that require immediate adaptation to shifting terrain and weather. The comparison between the two is not one of difficulty alone, but of structure, where one emphasizes endurance at extreme altitude and the other emphasizes responsiveness within a compressed and variable environment. This difference contributes to why Rainier continues to function as a recurring objective for climbers who are refining technical skill, even when they are already aware of its documented hazards. Seattle's proximity to Mount Rainier ensures continuous visual contact with the mountain, reinforcing its presence within everyday geographic awareness. On clear days, the mountain appears as a fixed feature of the horizon, visible from urban spaces, roads, and surrounding communities, creating a form of constant environmental familiarity that does not require direct engagement to remain present in daily perception. This visibility contributes to a unique relationship in which the mountain is simultaneously distant and immediate, part of the landscape, yet still functioning as an active destination for recreation and technical ascent. The result is a persistent awareness of the mountain's existence that does not depend on planning or intent, but on simple geographic continuity, where the presence of Rainier is integrated into the lived environment of those within viewing range. Direct exposure to alpine environments frequently results in revised interpretations of risk that do not necessarily eliminate future participation. Climbers who have spent time in high altitude or glaciated terrain often describe a shift in how they evaluate conditions, where uncertainty becomes more structurally understood rather than emotionally avoided. This adjustment does not always translate into reduced engagement, but instead into a more detailed awareness of how variables such as weather, terrain, and timing interact during an ascent. In this way, experience functions less as a deterrent and more as a refinement process, altering how future decisions are approached rather than whether they are made at all. The mountain in this sense becomes something that is not simply judged from a distance, but interpreted through accumulated understanding that continues to evolve with each exposure. In many documented climbing patterns, increased understanding of environmental hazards does not proportionally reduce engagement with similar objectives. This observation appears consistently across alpine environments, where skill development and hazard awareness grow in parallel with continued participation. Rather than producing disengagement, knowledge often becomes integrated into decision frameworks that account for risk as an expected component of activity rather than an anomaly to be avoided entirely. On Mount Rainier, this dynamic is reinforced by the structured nature of climbing seasons, guided expeditions, and established routes that allow climbers to return under varying conditions with adjusted preparation. The result is a system in which awareness of difficulty does not necessarily interrupt participation, but instead becomes part of how participation is structured over time. At the intersection of knowledge and motivation, Mount Rainier continues to function as an environment where awareness of risk and sustained interest coexist without resolution. The mountain does not operate as a fixed warning or deterrent in behavioral terms, but rather as a persistent presence that remains accessible, visible, and repeatedly approached through different levels of experience and intent. In this space, understanding does not produce closure, because each return introduces new conditions that shift how prior knowledge is applied. What emerges is not a conclusion about the mountain, but an ongoing relationship between human decision-making and an environment that does not stabilize in a way that would make a final interpretation complete. Long after the names fade from reports and the climbs are written into history, Mount Rainier remains exactly where it has always been, still drawing the next descent into the same uncertainty.